This is a DeepL.com translation. Discussion between Ptaah of the Pleiarian Federation and Billy Eduard Albert Meier. Beam 758. Contact Sunday, the 1st of November 2020, 21.58h.
What we have now discussed is probably still to be kept quiet about, because it would be impossible to make any statement if the...
It's okay, you don't have to keep talking, because it was already clear to me that everything had to stay between us before we started discussing the whole thing. Everything that has been said so far and put on the website, which is nothing more than a clarification, is already leading to telephone and written accusations and accusations of scaremongering. This is what we expected, that such morons would insult and ridicule us notorious troublemakers, know-it-alls, unteachable and conspiracy theorists, as well as imbeciles and other idiots. And promptly this happened. As I told you a week ago, 2 people called me at 1:30 a.m. in the morning to inform me that their father, who had called me 8 weeks ago and called me a fantastic, crazy and scaremonger, had fallen ill with the Coronary disease and died. They would apologize for their father's behavior and they would also change their minds. And on top of that, I received this short letter yesterday, which I will read to you in a moment. Meier is written in Epsilon. But it doesn't matter. Listen to what is written here.
Dear people of the FIGU and Billy Meier, in addition to what we already told you when we called you, there are now 3 more cases of COVID-19 in our widespread relationship, 2 of them very worrying. This is a real misfortune for our family and for our widespread relatives, but we have only ourselves to blame, because we were all of the same opinion as our father, and therefore also took part in demonstrations against wearing masks and keeping our distance and everything else. We now know that you from FIGU and Mr. Billy Meier are right, and that we have behaved quite wrongly and have also insulted you wrongly, and we apologize for that. We now know that FIGU and Mr. Billy Meier are not fooling around with your website and are not scaremongering, and we have to follow the rules which give us a possible protection against the COVID-19. Now we know that you're right and that you bring clear information from FIGU on your website, which is completely contrary to the only apparently good information from the FOPH and government and doctors, and contrary to the rejectors and conspirators, and which is really good and right, what we know now, and therefore we stick to what you write on your website, etc. We wish you and the FIGU the best and send you our best regards.
On the phone, people almost effusively thanked me and said that they would get back to me. So much so that I am now waiting to see what these people will tell me when they actually call me again. What unfortunately has to be said elsewhere is that know-it-all and other nonsense and sheer stupidity will continue to claim many more corona victims. The fact that her father died of the corona epidemic arouses in me compassion and suffering for the people, and for them it is probably a bitter lesson, because the callers have not only apologized for their father, but also for themselves and their relatives, who have now apparently all changed their minds.
Many people on Earth must obviously first become sufferers before they come to their senses and reason.
Unfortunately, this is so, and in many ways, because the bulk of Earthliness only turns on the thinking and tries to use the intellect and some reason when something has happened, but in doing so, it is only thinking about the exact moment halfway decently and rationally that has inevitably brought harm or even evil. This is the end of the whole thing, so that the next damage or disaster is already pre-programmed, which continues throughout life, and for many Earthlings makes their lives a misery, suffering, pain, distress, misery and grief. This also applies to all those lunatics who are in any way quarrelsome about the corona plague and vehemently and wisely deny the existence of the disease, deny it and demonstrate weakly against the disease, or corresponding preventive and safety measures, such as bans on going out, assembly, restaurants, sports events, etc. In the same way, all those who are stupid and irrational and morbidly stupid are to be mentioned who idiotically fantasize that an authority, an organization or a state etc. has deliberately created the epidemic and is spreading it worldwide in order to exterminate the worker earthiness as far as possible so that only the wealthy, rich and governed would survive. As for all those ricochets, troublemakers, corona deniers, know-it-alls and conspiracy theorists of all kinds who organize demonstrations and street terror with a huge roar. You said that all those who take part in them, in their stupidity, would neither know nor suspect that the authors of these demonstrations form a group that pursues purposes of overthrowing the state. The whole thing, as you said, is not just the roar of a single conspiracy theorist, but a well-thought-out plan to act in such a terrorist way, hostile to the state and order, that the Constitution and the basic laws collapse and anarchy and disorder is created. But this is not only to be controlled in the case of the corona shutdown and lockdown demonstrations, but also in the case of the Fridays for Future demos, whose idea actually goes back to the stupid little sweetling greeting. But the girl doesn't understand a thing about the climate change and has no idea that it is caused by overpopulation. But the authors of the demos take advantage of this, as you have explained, in order to work towards their anarchist plans, without the constitutional protection of the states in which the demos are organized and carried out, getting the idea that the demonstrations serve the purpose of building anarchism? This now, if I have understood all your statements correctly.
You have understood everything correctly, because for years the underground movement has been organizing demonstrations in Europe, especially in Germany, Switzerland and France, in order to stir up the people and to make the constitutions and basic laws unstable and ultimately to undermine them. This, if I use your vocabulary to explain. As far as everything else you have mentioned is concerned, it is indeed absolute nonsense, for I know that many people on earth actually think in this way, and that a great many wealthy and rich people are hated and marginalized by countless common people as a result of this absurd way of thinking. But this is only one of the reasons why there is such an evil discrepancy between the wealthy, the rich and the working class at the time of the epidemic, that in the future everything will lead to evil consequences. This on the one hand, while on the other hand the various demonstrations of this kind, which are organized underhandedly by anarchist elements for the purpose of collapsing the constitutions and basic laws, will still bring about bad luck, if the constitutional protection of the affected countries does not become aware of what the effective aim of certain demonstrations is. Billy, I know that because I saw it with your father's faith, which is, the major religions and sects play a very important role in this, as do many criminal organizations, right-wing extremists, the neo-Nazi system, left-wing extremists, as well as know-it-alls, conspiracy nuts and other lunatics of all kinds. In some cases, as you say, not even the ringleaders of the demonstrators know who is behind their own incitement. That is so, because the coming of what you are addressing will be absolutely inevitable.
I know, yes, but at the moment I have a question that concerns something else, namely China, because there is no news of the corona epidemic from all around the country, because it is kept quiet. There is also no or only a little general information being given all around, which would actually be important for the population, as you have explained to me, and of which I will perhaps explain the most important part, if I may.
You can do that, because there is nothing wrong with it, but it could be good to the contrary, but if you want, I can explain it too.
No, I can and I want to, because it allows you to correct me if I remember something wrong, and consequently don't interpret it correctly.
While this is well and responsibly thought out, and I know you would interpret everything correctly, I think it would be better if I explained what is necessary, which I will do only briefly, because enough has been said and explained about it without it really being taken into account by the majority of all leaders and by a large proportion of the peoples of all states, and consequently without much success.
Yeah, good. But I would also like to mention that I remember you saying in February during our private conversation that by the end of November almost 70 million people worldwide would be infected by the coronavirus, and 1.5 million would be killed by the epidemic. For Switzerland, you said that by the end of November there would be around 320,000 people infected and around 4,600 corona deaths, while elsewhere, for example in Germany, there would be 1.2 million people infected and 15,000 or 17,000 corona deaths. Worst affected, you said, will be the USA and the South American countries, as, for example, the USA will suffer 270,000 corona deaths at the end of November as a result of the mad President Trump, etc. However, these are only the official figures, while the number of unreported cases is much higher from December 2019, when the disease officially broke out. Nor do these official calculations include the numbers of corona-infected and corona deaths since 1981, when the disease found its first source after the U.S. American authorities declared it to be a disease. Agreed with Mao Zedong in his hatred of the USA. As a result, the country is now also the worst affected by the disease, through the fault of the feeble-minded U.S. President Trump.
Ptaah about that. Well, you know, what you say about my February data, what you say is that although it is broadly the same by the end of this month, in the last 2 days further calculations and a forecast have produced new data. These show that, as a result of the stupidity of the leaders and troublemakers in the nations, by the end of November the figures quoted in February will be exceeded, in some cases by a large margin, even in Europe, such as Germany, where the corona epidemic will far exceed the predicted figure of at least 15,000 deaths by the end of this month, and will even exceed 17,000.
Your information is always based on forecasts and possibly also on a foresight, and therefore not simply speculative. And the fact that everything will increase and spread even more than before is primarily the responsibility of the rulers, because they are absolutely incapable of holding their office and are unable to assess, judge or handle any crisis situations that may arise, so they are absolutely unfit for their office. If I look at the whole thing correctly, then the majority of all rulers are exactly what you always say about them, nothing more than people who are incapable of judgment, decision and action, who have an intelligence like inexperienced teenagers. Exactly the same as those who, as stupid, feeble-minded troublemakers and know-it-alls, as well as being monkey-like, breast-hammering conspiracy idiots, primitively and stupidly shouting around as street demonstrators, suffer from a severe lack of idiot intelligence. Unfortunately, this is the case everywhere, including Switzerland, because I see only one man in government who really masters his office and does it honorably, even if all the good-for-nothings mess up his work and squander the money he saves in the national budget. Well, the failures of the state, you and he, the very rulers who are incapable of leading the country and the people, have a culture, excuse me, it's not my way of speaking, but the only way to express it properly, like little shitheads who don't know what to do, because everything of their intelligence is in their trousers. This not only with regard to the overall management, but also in every emergency and crisis situation, as in the corona period. In fact, these leaders, as you call them, are, in my view, leaders, zeros and rivets in the leadership of the state, who effectively do not know what to do, and in their unlogy they cannot think sufficiently far ahead to prevent disaster, nor are they able to assess a situation correctly or act correctly. This fact is shown by the mere fact that they do not see all the necessities, as in the case of the corona pandemic, because instead of a nationwide one, a long-term, intentional, long-term lockdown with all the necessary requirements, which has been clarified in all necessary respects, is only prescribed for 2 or 3 weeks, although 2, 3 or 4 months would be sufficient to bring the pandemic to a standstill. But this is not done because of a lack of consideration for the economy and for the screaming demonstrators, etc., so that the disease cannot run out and start to spread again after the end of the lockdown. In addition to this, however, other disasters are being unleashed, such as the mass education of the population at the expense of firms, corporations, sports clubs, cultural workers, the hotel and catering industry and all kinds of small and medium-sized enterprises, etc. Millions and billions of dollars of financial resources are misappropriated, placing an unreasonable financial burden on the state and therefore on taxpayers. It is the taxpayers who are then responsible for the billions in debt incurred by the powerful state and who have to pay outrageously high taxes. In the process, state money is often squandered on people, companies, corporations, etc., who fraudulently take it all in and make a fuss about the sheer stupidity of the government that pays them huge sums of money. This is a natural consequence of the stupidity of the majority of those who are not aware of their responsibility as a state and who are also incapable of governing. He, the majority of all rulers, lacks all the necessary cognitive abilities, and consequently does not become aware of the important processes concerning his conscious perception, which is why he is neither able to carry out logical thought processes nor to recognize, realize and correctly judge precise, clear findings of effective actual circumstances, and to handle everything accordingly. This also means that these people also lack the necessary intelligence, which is absolutely essential for the cognitive abilities of man, to perceive the signals from the environment as an effective reality of reality and its truth consciously, clearly and correctly, to recognize, grasp, understand and process its meaning, to make the right decisions from it and to put them into action. But all this is not characteristic of the majority of misgoverning rulers, because their intelligence is not sufficient for this purpose, nor is their education, which is based only on inadequate theories and not on reality, its reality and truth, but only on bare assumptions, suppositions and imaginations. But then, imagination is also education. But I have digressed a little, because it must be said that all those people, from the smallest to the largest financial aid seekers, who irresponsibly ask the state and those stupid people in government for financial aid, belong to those people who, for personal enrichment, put a great deal of money into their own pockets, but on the other hand fob off those who work for them with low wages. Moreover, and this is a point of complete irresponsibility, which is commonplace among beggars, the majority of workers, families, singles, many organizations, companies, corporations, associations, etc., and all governments, that they have not created any financial reserves for themselves, but have always squandered their coal and continue to do so. The consequence of this is, as is clearly evident in today's Corona era, that all of them have experienced a time of need, because on the one hand they have all been completely mismanaged throughout the ages, and on the other hand the colonels have only cheated into their own pockets. Thus, by and large, there is no moral or financial security, let alone a nest egg for all cases. What has happened with regard to many beggars as well as many organizations, companies, corporations and associations, and with practically all governments, which should in principle act as good role models, but do exactly the opposite, usually applies equally to the people. The people, that is the majority of all employees, families and singles, are just as nonsensical and irresponsible in their perception of responsibility as the majority of all bosses and owners who determine the economy and who are only concerned about their own well-being and their assets of millions or billions. The majority of the people, as just mentioned, live for the moment, squandering all their money, their often meager rewards for travel, luxury and pleasure, nonsense. But fanatics are also throwing their hard-earned money away completely madly for expensive entrance fees, contributions and donations for moronic public sports events etc., instead of doing sports themselves and thus doing something good for their own health. And no fanatical sports spectator will worry about how moronic such entrance fees, contributions and donations are. For example, the fact that sports greats of all kinds get their hands on gold noses in the millions with the contributions, entrance fees and donations, all at the expense of the stupid spectator fanatics, at whose expense the sportsmen can indulge in their pleasure and enrich themselves. This instead of the athletes doing a clean, fair and valuable job, from which they shy away, but enrich themselves with the money of the simple-minded fanatical spectators, whose intelligence is obviously not yet normal. It is therefore no wonder that countless brazen and brainless people take to the streets as demonstrators, shouting insanely for some dubious cause, without understanding anything about the whole thing, for which they idiotically demonstrate and terrorize, because they are chasing after someone who is ignorant and stupid and are crying along pointlessly with their stupid slogans, just as they have no idea what is going on in the correspondingly controlled demonstrations in a profoundly anarchistic way. This, for example, also about the small, ignorant Greek Thurbo with her Fridays for Future mania, which she used to trivialize truancy. And I say Thurbo, because the little brat, alien to all facts, has managed to bind countless stupid people to her stupidity and ignorance, and to demonstratively charge them all with howling horny, who scribble about senselessly, not understanding anything and stupidly stupid for something they have no idea about, just like little Greta Thunberg does not, and also not about the fact that there is an anarchistic control behind their demos. Their nonsensically crafted demonstration nonsense has, on top of everything else, caused the majority of the stupid people in the governments to respond to it and now knock around with big words and useless good faint deeds for climate protection. This is done by writing and producing nonsensical new regulations and laws, as well as by spending millions of dollars on new and absolutely useless environmental protection measures, which do not solve the problem at all, because it is basically only based on overpopulation and the lack of resources in their needs, wishes and desires, which can only be brought about and provided by all-around destructive, annihilating and exterminating machinations on the planet, nature, its fauna and flora as well as the ecosystems and the impairment of the atmosphere and the climate. If the whole activity of the rulers is scrutinized, then it becomes clear, first of all, that they only organize the whole thing in order to protect themselves from it and not to be catapulted out of their offices. And secondly, it is all about reassuring the vast majority of the stupid people, pleasing them and making them believe that something is actually being done about climate change, which in reality is not the case. This is not because in reality nothing is being done about the overpopulation, and there is not even a mention of it, whose needs and the fulfillment of those needs have led to the destruction of all ecosystems. If, however, demonstrations are carried out, which are usually anarchistically controlled by certain elements and only serve the purpose of terror, but not the real purpose of stupid shouting around, then such demonstrations should be prohibited and prevented by law, including demonstrations like Fridays for Future, which are controlled underground. For my part, I have nothing against demonstrations, if everything is going right with them and thus effectively represent and demand real facts in a justified way. And if decency and order are maintained then there is no underlying anarchism behind them. But if ignorance and bullshit and anarchism play along, then my agreement ends absolutely and in any case. But as far as the all-destroying machinations of the overpopulation are concerned, as I have repeatedly predicted the catastrophes in this respect since the 1940s, and have tried to make known everything about thousands of public organs etc. worldwide as a whole, this has not helped. Because whatever I have done and whatever I have tried to do has not helped, just as nothing has ever been accepted by any media and nothing has ever been published, but generally everything has been thrown to the wind, until today. All of the overpopulation machinations led to the poisoning of the atmosphere and all of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as to the irreversible destruction of the planet itself, both internally and on the surface. This, whereby in nature and its fauna and flora many things were not only destroyed, but completely eradicated, but also the climate was badly affected and will now in the distant future bring enormous changes, destruction, devastation as well as fatalities and natural changes. All necessary orders are questioned, terror is organized through demonstrations and destruction is wrought. Rioting and violence cause damage, as in the case of the corona epidemic, where thousands are infected with the virus during demonstrations. But, as the saying goes, stupidity and stupidness have no limits, and all those who are fogged over by them are not accessible to normal, healthy thoughts that are logical and reasonable. And since that is the case, when I come back to what I started but have not yet finished, there is something else to be said for the fact that people in general are also recklessly failing to take precautions for crisis situations, since they do not even usually stock up on food for 2 or 3 months, so that they do not have to leave their homes in case of an emergency. On the other hand, people get their munchies every day, go shopping and expose themselves to danger. Otherwise they would starve to death if they could not buy anything. Such behavior is absolutely irresponsible.
This is all correct. and I think that it is very important to explain the whole thing according to our latest and very precise research findings, so that these latest and more advanced findings and their results will be published on the FIG website as soon as you have retrieved and written down our entire interview. As usual, I want to present all my explanations in a generally simple language without technical terms, in order to make the whole thing, as I have learned from you, understandable for the majority of the non-academically educated population. But now I would like to mention what we first spoke about.
1. Infection of corona disease by inhalation.
A corona disease is mainly caused by inhaling the coronavirus in the form of speech droplets and respiratory aerosols, as well as through contact with saliva, but also through various other forms of infection, such as the following.
B. Coronavirus disease caused by touching, contact or direct contact of / with sick persons or by touching corona sufferers directly.
B. Direct contact with clothing, door handles, goods and objects, etc., which are contaminated as a result of secreted speech droplets, saliva, blood and respiratory aerosols from people infected with the coronavirus.
C. Touching or coming into contact with any surface of objects, goods, merchandise, clothing or food, etc., contaminated with the coronavirus to which the virus adheres may result in infection if the eyes, nose, mouth, open wound, open pores or abrasions are touched afterwards, which inevitably allows the virus to penetrate the body.
D. Coronaviruses adhering to objects, goods, merchandise and clothing, etc., can remain contaminating and active as deposits for varying lengths of time, ranging from hours to days, weeks or months, depending on the time, but this is extremely rare and is determined by various prevailing climatic and environmental factors. In the same way, the long-term survival of the virus depends on the conditions of the material of the objects, their surfaces, temperature and humidity, etc.
The probability, however, that a person infected with the corona epidemic will contaminate objects, food or any goods, etc., with the coronavirus to such an extent that infection can occur over a long period of time is, as I explained, relatively low and rare, but counted for a short time in a few hours, absolutely acute, so that disinfection with a suitable high percentage disinfectant of objects, communication equipment and door handles, etc., is necessary and important.
A special note.
With regard to the fact that health authorities, virologists, epidemiologists and immunologists, etc., do not give a risk assessment of infection via objects, goods, clothing, food, merchandise, animals and animals contaminated with the virus as sources of infection and are unlikely to do so, this is an irresponsible false statement and misleading. Although infection by the coronavirus in the manner mentioned above via goods, commodities and animals, including pets, etc., is rare and minimal, the fact of possible infection is nevertheless true to reality. Therefore I will repeat the following to the whole according to our research results and findings. How long the coronavirus survives on the surfaces of objects, fruit, vegetables, foodstuffs and goods of all kinds varies completely depending on the type of mutation of the virus, the goods and the environmental conditions. Consequently, the adhesion and infecting effect of the virus can last from a few hours or days to weeks or months, but under ideal conditions the virus can survive for years and for an endless period of time. This is basically dependent on the overall atmospheric and climatic conditions, especially the surfaces, temperature, humidity and other influences. However, the probability that a person infected by the coronavirus will contaminate any goods with the virus is very low and extremely rare. As a result, as our latest clear research results show, the risk of infection of goods of all kinds is very low and rare, even if the transport of delivered or imported food, clothing, goods and other goods of all kinds is exposed to all kinds of special conditions and temperatures.
2. The coronavirus cannot die.
The virus cannot die or be killed because it is not a life form, but an infectious organic structure that spreads as a variant outside cells by transmission, but can only reproduce and cause harm within a suitable host cell. The virus itself does not consist of one or more cells, but is, as I explained, a lifeless infectious organic structure.
3. Risks of infection through the digestive system.
Our sciences have facts which show that, with regard to the risk of infection, persons, animals and creatures infected by the coronavirus are also weaned off the corona pathogens through their excrement and contaminating the environment, so that the virus can spread through various circumstances and spread to humans and cause infections, as well as through vomiting excretions.
4. Inheritance of the coronavirus.
Another of our scientific findings is that, in the molecular domain, basic phenomena of certain characteristics of the coronavirus can also be inherited by the offspring, which means that women infected with corona disease transmit the virus to their fruit and later give birth to offspring infected with corona in the womb. This, like the coronavirus, means that men ejaculate the virus into the vaginal canal during orgasm through their sperm in their sexual partner, after which it is transported into the vaginal vault of the woman to pass through the uterus into the fallopian tubes and fertilize an egg released from the ovary, which is infected with the coronavirus through the sperm, thus giving birth to corona-infected offspring, which, as a result of our research into corona infants and offspring infected with the virus, are then born corona children.
5. Coronavirus disease without symptoms, but with antibodies.
Our scientific and very precise findings show that 7 to 11% of the world's population is affected by the coronavirus, depending on the country and its immune system, etc. Without the people affected noticing it themselves, because no actual symptoms of the disease occur, and because the disease cannot be medically diagnosed, but only becomes detectable when antibodies are formed and these can be detected.
6. Symptoms of corona disease.
Corona disease is much more diverse in the nature of its symptoms than is assumed by terrestrial virologists and all other professionals, with the result that any ailments and diseases that occur are wrongly defined as known insanities and therefore incorrectly treated, leading to many deaths. The symptoms of a corona disease vary according to the immune system, the health of the individual, his or her state of health, genetic stability, blood group, morality and mental state, etc. And therefore different preforms can indicate infection, such as headaches, cough, swindle, nausea, chest pain, heart complaints, swallowing difficulties, loss of taste, change of taste, visual disorders, digestive disorders, hearing disorders, thoughts, feelings, psychological changes, concentration difficulties, fever, respiratory difficulties, coordination problems, language difficulties, movement disorders, balance disorders, diarrhea.
7. Illness figures.
The particularly rapid and strong increase in the number of cases of the second wave of corona disease is due to the fact that the pathogen could not circulate for weeks due to the lockdown practice, but could be kept under control to a certain extent. However, because the curfews were intelligently neglected and lifted again, the coronavirus can and will again spread very quickly and devastatingly worldwide and now cause a much greater disaster, causing a very high number of deaths by the end of November, which will rise to 1.6 million by the end of this month of November, but only officially, because the number of unreported cases will be much higher, as was also the case in the past. This, while on Earth, also by the end of November, some 65 million official corona diseases will be reported.
8. Civil fundamental rights laws are wrong in crisis situations.
Even before the first inadequate and very laughable measures to contain the disease were taken by the leaders and authorities, it would have been necessary, contrary to the fundamental civil rights laws, etc., to impose a blockade of the starting point and thus to rigorously enforce all the necessary security measures to guarantee free civil freedom of action, the health security of a population, as well as of an individual person, must always be given priority and should never be prevented by legislation, just as it should never be prevented by an ill-considered false constitutional law. In order not only to contain the corona epidemic, but to stop it and allow it to run its course, there is a need to revise a false fundamental right to abolish a civil freedom of action which acts without reason and thus endangers health and life. This should have been done a month earlier, before the first measures were taken, which would have controlled the whole situation and prevented the further spread of the disease, and consequently could not have escalated.
9. Different corona symptoms with the coronavirus.
The coronavirus does not cause the same symptoms in all people, and therefore different effects occur in different people, but most infected people develop mild to moderate symptoms, which disappear after some time and do not cause severe symptoms or require hospitalization. After a certain period of time, the entire disease symptoms subside again and recovery is achieved. However, despite the development of antibodies, this does not guarantee immunity and therefore no so-called herd immunity is achieved, but a new infection is just as likely as a new outbreak of the disease through virus impulses stored in the organs, which are still absolutely unknown to all earthly specialists in virology, immunology, epidemiology and medicine and are neither recognizable nor detectable.
10. The coronavirus mutates from time to time.
The coronavirus, which mutates or changes from time to time, is insidious and does not guarantee that recovery will be effective. This is because, according to exact research results, viral impulses are deposited in the human organism, especially in the organs affected by the disease, which means that after recovery, every recovered person without exception remains susceptible to the virus, so that sooner or later a new infection or outbreak of a disease is likely to occur. The earthly virologists and epidemiologists, etc., as well as all medical doctors of all kinds, have no idea, let alone knowledge or even effective knowledge, of the researched fact that an epidemic impulse deposit can occur, which can lead to an infection even after recovery and thus the epidemic can break out again.
11. Long-term effects of the corona disease.
The disease caused by the coronavirus always leads to long-term consequences of one kind or another, whereby these usually take the form of an impulse deposit in the organs affected by the disease, which, however, is still unknown to all terrestrial medicine and will remain so for a long time to come. Long-term consequences of a corona epidemic disease are, however, known to the entire field of terrestrial medicine, whereby the consequences of the corona epidemic can be of various kinds, such as impairment of consciousness, susceptibility to cancer, arterial hypertension, high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, dementia, chronic brain disease, loss of cognitive abilities, memory loss, neurodegenerative vascular diseases of the brain, brain infections / brain diseases, chronic intestinal diseases, organ damage, lung diseases, hormonal disorders, disorders of the intestines, bowels, joint diseases, hair loss, hereditary impairments, thyroid gland diseases, iron deficiency, susceptibility to infection, diabetes mellitus, drug intolerance, sun sensitivity, dietary intolerance, protein intolerance, conjunctivitis, depression, headaches / migraines, vision or eye problems, etc.
12. The spread of corona disease.
As we have noted, no official information was given to the population worldwide by the leaders and authorities of all countries at the time of the official outbreak of the corona disease, as has not been the case to date. Even at the beginning of the year, when the first information was made public by the public media worldwide, no official and educational information was given in an irresponsible manner by governmental authorities about the various forms of risk of infection by the corona epidemic. Nor has there been any necessary and important clarification of the multiple symptoms, the effects of the disease on the immune system and the whole organ system, the psyche, and the different ways in which people behave in relation to the pros and cons of views and opinions. No necessary information was disseminated on the foreseeable positive and negative reactions, views, perceptions and attitudes of the public, and consequently no correct behavior with regard to appropriate safety behavior. The absolutely irresponsible omission of this necessary information has so far caused a great deal of suffering, grief and damage all over the world, and this will continue in the future, because against all reason, the old ways are being continued. Degenerating demonstrations and actions of unscrupulous and irresponsible demonstrators, phrasemongers, know-it-alls and conspiracy theorists who negate the truth have already led and will continue to lead to hundreds of thousands of people worldwide succumbing to the corona epidemic. This, as well as through the fault of the insecure demonstrating loudmouths, renownnists, braggarts, right-wingers and mouth heroes, will continue to bring about hundreds of thousands of new infections in the month of November, which will claim tens of thousands more victims of all ages. All around the world, no action was taken by the leaders and authorities to prevent disaster, either publicly or directly to the people in their households, and no intentional information was effectively provided on all possible necessities, as should have been the duty of every leader and authority in the exercise of its responsibilities, but was not carried out by a single state or authority. The overall result, according to our very precise observations and clarifications over months throughout the world, of the urgently needed clarification and all the information concerning the corona epidemic for the populations of all countries by the irresponsible governments and authorities was and is terrifying. This is because virtually nothing has been done by those responsible for everything in the way that it should have been done, in terms of education and information. Only on certain internet websites have the responsible authorities published and continue to publish a few and, moreover, insignificant technical explanations in a language that is incomprehensible to many or even the majority of the population. And, as you have always said, what I liked about it was that when I translate the whole of what I have said, in order to make it understandable, the whole content of the state's information poor publications is interwoven with a lot of trivial and confusing ballast and rubbish, which cannot be coordinated and therefore understood by the potential readership. All extremely important information and clarification of the way in which the infection and spread of the disease, i.e., how everything basically takes place, works and degenerates, as well as the fact that the corona disease is neither a conspiracy nor a conspiracy theory, has not been provided since the official announcement of the disease in December 2019 or in January and February 2020 by any governmental information of importance to the population, and therefore not published. No such important and necessary information has been provided to the population. Therefore no effective informative leaflets have been published and nothing important has been made known, nor that the coronavirus spreads and infects in different ways.
Inhalation, droplet, aerosol, saliva and touch contact infection.
A cough.
B bubbles. C sneezing D speak. E screaming F exhale. G body contact H excrement. Eye contact with objects, goods, rare. K when dependent air transfer over a distance of several meters, atmospheric aerosols. L food, rare. M contact with infected animals, rare. N body perspiration.
B atmospheric aerosols.
And normal atmospheric aerosols that float freely in the atmosphere, but which are transmitted to other people within a radius of a few square meters by direct droplet or respiratory aerosol ejection from people suffering from corona disease through the atmosphere/air, and depending on the movement of the wind, can become infectious to other people.
The coronavirus is decidedly much more infectious than is generally assumed by the entire League of Medical Virology, Epidemiology and Infectology, etc. because the manifold possibilities of infection are much more widespread than is assumed.
13. The spread of corona disease.
The coronavirus does not only spread through the direct and indirect infections mentioned above, but also through other infectious pathways, such as contamination through the digestive system under certain circumstances, as well as through contact with certain animal species that may be carriers of the coronavirus. And this fact is effective against all negations in every pathological know-how of inadequate specialists, even if this fact is contradicted wrongly by virologists, epidemiologists, medical doctors and infectious disease specialists, etc., who are lacking in knowledge and understanding, and the opposite is vehemently claimed contrary to their truth. If we look at reality, we can see that certain animal species and some animals are susceptible to the coronavirus and can therefore become infected and spread the virus to humans. And if they come into direct contact with a person, either directly or indirectly via sound droplets, breath aerosols, saliva or bite wounds, then inevitably humans are also infected in this way. This, as well as through the inhalation of air polluted with viruses in closed rooms, the virus is transmitted. It should also be noted that food contaminated with food and contact with contaminated objects, etc., can cause infection, although these two possibilities are considered to be rare.
14. Beginning of the corona period.
The most difficult time of the corona pandemic is only just beginning and will claim many lives around the globe, because the majority of all leaders will not act correctly and will remain irresponsible in this respect, as well as those who have fallen victim to neurasthenia correlatoria or the Pleiarian. This includes all those who indulge in stupidity, those who, on the one hand, are irresponsible and act as leaders of the state, but also all those of the populations who rebel against decreed halfway useful security regulations. This includes all the stupid and brazen know-it-alls, yahoos, troublemakers, right-wingers, as well as all imaginative conspirators, trial hawkers or jesters, shysters and litigants who senselessly incriminate authorities and courts. These people lack a high degree of intelligence and thus of reason, which has the consequence that they harm themselves and put themselves in their graves, because it is usually they themselves who, as a result of their lack of intelligence, carelessly infect themselves with the virus and possibly die from the epidemic. Such people are not normal troublemakers, but they often suffer from a personality disorder, often a disease that is linked to psychopathy, collective bickering, character neurosis, hysteria, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or a personality disorder. Disturbance as, however, fundamentally corresponds to a profound religious delusion. There are different types of individual and collective coways of both sexes, e.g., psychological, sociological and psychiatric quibblers, as well as political right and left-wing quibblers, character quibblers, religious quibblers and demonstration quibblers, etc., all of whom live in a timeless mode of defense.
15. Antibody studies.
As for antibody studies carried out worldwide by virologists, epidemiologists, medical doctors, etc., they all underestimate the number of people infected, which is much higher than expected. The number of people who have died of the corona epidemic is also much higher than expected, as the first corona victims were registered by us as early as 1981. In the last 40 years, the number of corona victims has increased steadily due to the constant changes and mutations of the virus, and we have found that this number has now risen to more than 3 million.
16. Rumor spreading, hysteria, conspiracy theories.
As in ancient times, rumors spread very fast, especially concerning a disease and thus an epidemic or pandemic, and immediately conspiracy theories, know-it-alls, nonsense claims and lies, as well as deliberate purpose and panic-inducing lies, are raised and cause collective states of fear and hysteria, which, once caused, can hardly or not be resolved and may cause a lot of mischief. This is clearly also the case with the corona epidemic, as evidenced by the stupidly audacious, nonsensical and totally irresponsible, reckless and epidemic-promoting corona demonstrations, which are directed against prescribed safety measures and dangerously promote mass corona infections. That is the main thing I have to say today about the corona disease, although there is much more to explain, but the whole thing would go far too far, for which the time available to me is not enough, because I still have a duty to do.
Well, I don't want to keep you in suspense, but if I may ask you something or two, 3 questions? Ptaah, of course, because I am not in that kind of hurry, because what I said in that regard was only about further explanations in relation to corona disease. Oh, well, and right away like me, you also always talk about corona disease, but not about corona pandemic. Why? I use the term pandemic for myself, because the term pandemic does not give me the necessary understanding of the danger of the whole epidemic. This is despite the fact that the term pandemic is an umbrella term for a disease that covers many countries and is therefore usually global in scope, which in turn is nothing more than a degenerated epidemic of great proportions.
What is right, of course, and that includes your understanding of the whole, which is also the same for me, which is why I speak of epidemic and not pandemic just like you do.
Good, then it's clear. Then we have published all the relevant information that you have given us on our website, which has been well received in the form of thank you calls from various countries, as well as a declaration that the callers will strictly adhere to the safety advice given. There have also been many complaints that such important information as we at FIG publish is not made public in their own country, nor can they find it on the internet. Again, it was said that I should thank you and you Pleiarians as a whole, as well as all our FIG members worldwide, even if, for example, the passive members are not directly involved in our FIG work and not in the information put on the net, but they are still indirectly involved, because they, the callers in the center, have been made aware of our FIG website by FIG passive members, etc.
That is very gratifying. And for the words of thanks addressed to us, I return our thanks to all the people, and especially my personal thanks to all those who address their words of thanks about you to me and to all of us. And what you mentioned elsewhere, it is indeed as you said.
Good, all the people around the world who called me and thanked you, and all of you can now read your thanks on our website. Then the question, what do you think about the particularly fast and strong increase of corona disease in Europe?
You answered your question yourself at the beginning of our conversation that the corona pathogen could only circulate at a reduced rate due to the lockdown. But the fact that the corona epidemic could spread quickly and is now rampant, and that it will rampant even faster than before in this new month, and will claim many thousands of lives, is due on the one hand to the sheer stupidity or illogicality or lack of thought on the part of the state leaders. On the other hand, the whole illogically caused disaster also results from the stupidity and lack of intelligence of all those whom you call brainless people, who, as liars of the truth, demonstrate their ignorance and unreasonableness as well as their inability to bring about even a single clear thought. As a result, they are blind in their perception and do not recognize and understand that they themselves are the greatest sufferers of the corona disease, as you have already predicted. Basically, it is they who, through their twice stupid and demonstrative roundups, their group formation and their disregard for all caution towards the corona plague, are attacked by it and either die from it or suffer from its late effects for the rest of their lives, as you have already said.
Thanks. So we agree. And to what you have said now about the bean-straw stupidity of the demonstrators, I think that for all these brainless people, these totally useless elements, instead of demonstrating stupidly, shouting around and showing their self-shameful stupidity etc., it would be more important to do something really useful and valuable and to stick to human respect, honor, dignity and order. This, by doing everything possible against all war and terror, violence and crime, as well as doing the very best for peace, freedom, the rebirth of nature, its fauna and flora, the functioning of all ecosystems and the tranquility of the planet itself. Only in this way could the state of the atmosphere and the climate change again for the better and for the good. But the whole thing would also require that overpopulation be drastically reduced by a worldwide and multi-year controlled birth stop, and that birth control be introduced. If all delusional believers in God of all religions, as well as all other delusional believers of any other worship eminence, such as an ox, donkey, chicken or monkey, such as the Hindu monkey god Hanuman, were to consider the enormous mass of overpopulation, then something could change for the better in this respect. If one were to pay special attention to the lies of mad and confused Christianity, which in its pathological belief in God and its mad delusion of the go and multiply fantasized by a mentally ill erotomaniac, then it would be recognized that as a result of the delusional belief in God, the earth has become an excessive sexual intercourse addiction, from which habitual copying has developed. All this, however, does not only concern the simple populations of all states, but it reaches up to the colonels, the rulers, as well as to the wealthy and rich, up to the bigwigs of all religions and sects, as in Christianity from the simple preacher to the parish priest to the pope and his clergy, as history has proven from time immemorial. Many of these reverend or clerics have given birth to countless descendants and have contributed to the endless growth of overpopulation through their erotomania. This, however, is still cultivated in this way today, as is pedophilia, but this is deliberately concealed and swept under the table. Pornocracy and mistress rule, or the influence of mistresses on those in power, also contributed a great deal to the enormous growth of overpopulation. But this is a story in itself, which shows that countless descendants were also born in this way and the overpopulation was driven up. But in relation to the papacy, history shows that in Christianity the periods of the papacy and the clergy have always been erotomaniacs, and therefore the whole thing is effectively erotomaniacs, with power games and intrigues, even assassination. The early 10th century, for example, which began with Pope Sergius III in 904, ended in 963 with the death of Pope John XII, who was murdered, for which the term Saeculum Obscurum or Dark Century was coined in the 16th century. Especially during the erotomania period, the popes and various rulers of Rome were under the direct power of a few aristocratic mistresses, Theodora I and her daughters Marozia and Theodora II. At that time, the popes had little backbone of their own and could only keep their erotomaniacal tendencies under control. They could only live out their erotomaniacal tendencies with the Roman mistresses of the nobility, to whom they were in bondage and who demanded that the popes produce holy descendants. However, this fact was vehemently concealed from the outside world, and anyone who did let something of this be known was simply silenced and removed from the world. Consequently, little was revealed, such as what was officially published and handed down, which cost several lives, but which is the subject of the following list of mistress popes who were dependent on their forced erotomaniac lovers.
Sergius III 904-911 Lover of Marozia, Father of John XI Anastasius III 911-913 Lando 913-914 John X 914-928 Imprisoned and murdered on the orders of Marozia Leo VI 928-928 Stephen VII 928-931 John 11 931-935 Son of Sergius III and Marozia Leo VII 936-939 Stephen 8 939-942 Marinus II 942-946 Agapitus II 946-955 John 12 955-963 Grandson of Marozia, elected Pope at the age of 17.
As for all the traditions from these bygone times, most of which have been recorded by the critic of the conditions in Rome, Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, They usually correspond to what really happened at that time, which, however, how could it be otherwise, is denied by everything and everyone, negating, envying, doubting and know-it-all, etc. And since it is usually not possible to verify the traditions through research, some or all of them are questioned, even when contemporary witnesses can testify to something with a word of honor, but are simply disregarded or called liars. The fact is, however, that at that time Theodora I and Marozia were the real political powers in Rome, swinging their clubs, cranking out their husbands, and having their sexual desires fulfilled by the popes in order to have holy descendants. A practice that still secretly works today, although the manner and status of the mates and the recipients has changed somewhat, and the whole thing has taken on a more popular character, although it is still possible to go from preacher to colonel, and from the simplest to the most well-born, and thus with everything in between. Now, regarding the Roman period, it should be added that Marozia murdered Pope John X, who had been brought into office by her mother Theodora I, and that she was not only the forced mistress, but also the mistress of Pope Sergius III, who had fallen irremediably in love with her and had to bear her a holy son, who later sat on the throne of Peter as Pope John XI, while his mother Marozia tried to keep her favorite, Leo VI, in office, to power. If we now think a little sensibly about these early stories, we can see that in the course of the last 2 millennia pornocracy or mistress rule also led to this, and everything was done to completely overpopulate the earth. On the other hand, it is also clear that the overflowing humanity has inevitably had a destructive influence on nature, fauna and flora and all ecosystems, destroying many things and destroying or eradicating countless others. Today the atmosphere is dangerously poisoned and, in addition, it affects the climate, forcing it into an epochal change, through which now and henceforth enormous natural disasters and an inner eruptive rebellion of the planet will take place. The only consequence of all this is the mass overpopulation, which is destroying the planet inside and outside through its endlessly increasing needs, wishes and desires, etc., and in addition to destroying and eradicating nature, the flora, fauna and animal world, putting all ecosystems out of action and harassing the atmosphere and the climate. And this may even lead to collapse, to the final collapse, which could then possibly wipe out all life on Earth, as I have been predicting since the 1940s, but which no one has wanted to hear since then and no one wants to hear today either, but perhaps when it is too late. Through the stupidity and the somehow degenerated and uncontrolled libidinous desires and behavior of countless earthlings, the earth is becoming more and more and endlessly overpopulated. This results in and increases religious, sectarian and racial hatred, as well as hatred against people of other faiths and other ethnic groups or other indigenous people and peoples, who are hated, ostracized, abused, robbed, persecuted, warned and murdered both religiously and politically as ethnic scum. The term ethnicity alone, which means people in Greek, is sufficient for delusions of God believers, political madmen, as well as for extremists of any kind to discriminate against individuals, groups of people or entire peoples, to abuse, persecute, ruin or murder them because of their origin, culture, language, religion, history and or economic system. And all this has been going on since time immemorial, as well as in the present day, as it is becoming more and more prevalent and is expanding into the future, in relation to the growth of overpopulation. So it is happening, because with it the number of the increasingly fanatical delusional believers is also increasing, and with it the fanatical agitation of one believer of one religion or sect against believers of another religion or sect. Very often, political delusions are also involved, as in the case of the entire Nazi regime, the hatred against Judaism, which started 2,000 years ago by Christianity and has cost countless lives, ultimately through Hitler and Himmler's genocide. Delusion, which still exists today due to the neo-Nazis in many places in the world, not only in Germany, but worldwide, like in Russia, where no other Eastern European country has such a violent neo-Nazi scene as Russia. There is agitation against all those of non-Russian origin. Even excesses of violence are not uncommon. For years, calls for killings and execution videos have been circulating on the internet, and although the Ukrainian conflict has split the extreme right-wing scene, its potential for violence remains unbroken. Militant right-wing extremists have been drawing attention to themselves for many years through acts of violence, with hundreds of people murdered as a result of right-wing terror in the last 10 years. Thousands of others have been attacked and often seriously injured. Most of the victims come from Central Asia, as well as the Caucasus, but there have also been Antifa activists as well as homeless people, homosexuals and judges who have been attacked, injured or killed. There is no other Eastern European country with such a violent neo-Nazi scene as in Russia, with tens of thousands of members. The Department for Combating Extremism of the Russian Ministry of the Interior estimated already in 2010 that at least 150 active militant neo-Nazi groups exist, and this number is increasing. Right-wing extremism experts from the Moscow Center for Information and Analysis (SOVA) pointed out some time ago that it is not possible to determine the exact number of existing groups, nor to calculate their membership exactly. Similarly, there are groups of this kind in the USA, such as the Aryan Brotherhood, also called the Brand, Alice Baker or 1-2 Abe. This racist and neo-Nazi American gang was founded in 1967 in San Quentin State Prison, California. Furthermore, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, a racist and violent as well as right-wing extremist and still active secret society, is also active in the USA, where it is also involved in terrorist and murderous activities. Especially in the first half of the 20th century, this secret society was particularly active in the USA, using evil terrorist means to unscrupulously attack and kill, especially against the equality of African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan, whose men distinguished themselves with white hoods and burning crosses, dominated a small town in northern Florida, for example, where they rode through the fields at night and hunted African Americans to hang them from trees, but hardly anyone dared to talk about it, let alone do anything about it. Even today, this criminal racist secret society in the USA has an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 or more members, although this clan is still publicly tolerated and also maintains contacts with right-wing extremists abroad, especially in Germany. All such radical right-wing groups and their members, such as the alt-right movement or the Ku Klux Klan, etc., as a rule belong to Protestant Christianity and consider themselves to be good Christians, but who live under the delusion that they have to exercise white supremacy, because the white race alone, Hitler and his neo-Nazis send their regards, is supposed to have absolute authority to dominate in and over America. This was actually the case until the liberation of the slaves in 1865, after the American Civil War between the North and the South from 1861 to 1865. After which the liberation of slaves was concluded and came about through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, which served as the foundation of all social order.
Addendum from Wikipedia: The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America definitively abolished slavery and forced labor except for offenders throughout the territory of the United States. It was passed by Congress on the 31st of January 1865 and submitted to the states for ratification, and came into force on the 18th of December 1865. The 13th Amendment, when adopted, was the first amendment in more than 60 years. Together with the subsequent 14 and 15 amendments, it forms the Reconstruction Amendments adopted after the War of Secession.
The Ku Klux Klan continues to do so, however, and in the last century, especially in 1995, it continued to terrorize African Americans and other colored people, as well as Jews, Catholics and homosexuals with vicious racial hassarades. And still today, torture, flogging, arson, lynching and open murder of African Americans are the terrorist instruments of the Ku Klux Klan. Even today, its members still walk around with white hoods and shout their hate and hate tirades without being bothered by any law, just as they can still secretly exercise their terror without being affected by laws. Although the Ku Klux Klan was banned by law in 1871, it was refounded in the mid-1920s, so the whole thing continues without any legal action against it, because even judges and politicians of national importance listen to and protect this Klan. The hatred and the desire for revenge against people of different faith, against those who think differently and against other ethnic groups has lurked secretly hidden and eroded in the deepest character of all believers in God or other believers of any religious faith. Of Joe's sectarian directions as well as in political believers, in troublemakers, as well as very malicious and all other troublemakers of all kinds. The constant deep-seated hatred, together with an equally deep-seated desire for revenge, which the believers are not aware of, are constantly lurking for an outbreak, for quarreling, only to suddenly break out uncontrollably. And if hatred and revenge are triggered, then everything very quickly leads to violence, the death penalty, war, terror and torture, as well as murder and manslaughter, without the affected delusional believers in God having the slightest idea that all this, despite their religious sectarian delusion, is rotting away deeply hidden in their character and immediately breaks through to the outside world and wreaks havoc as soon as there is even the slightest cause for it. All this has been inherent to all believers in God from time immemorial, predetermined by the delusions of an alleged God, who is idiotically and feebly attributed love, goodness, forbearance and at the same time revenge, punishment, violence as well as the advocacy and blessing of war and murder. And all godly people who believe in God have fallen into this idiocy, whereby they do not realize that everything is against their own thoughts and feelings and against all reason, against all reality and truth, and against life in general, and against all humanity and justice. And this is fundamentally so, and this is true for every believer, although no one notices or understands this, because everyone is blinded and deaf by his faith. And if a believer would recognize, grasp and understand this truth, he would sink into the ground and rot in shame and his own stupidity. But unfortunately it is as it has been since time immemorial that the majority of earthlings have fallen into a delusion of belief in God and therefore cannot really think, so they remain stupid. And in addition, today and tomorrow people are becoming more and more unable to live, more and more mentally unstable and ill, because they have completely forgotten how to think, decide and act. Therefore, it is of no use to appeal to their reason and to remind them.
Do not believe, think for yourself. Do not let decide for yourself. Do not let act yourself.
What I have now uncovered in my monologue is what has been occupying me all my life, as well as many other things. But now I have said some of it again. But what I am still interested in is what you think about all this. What has been going on for some time with vaccines to prevent the spread of the corona disease?
Your question had to come, because it corresponds to your sense of responsibility and logic. But my opinion is that all the vaccines that are currently being researched in various ways and that need to be applied quickly are totally under-researched and will be applied prematurely in a very short time.
You mean the whole thing is like an ill-considered quick bleach, right? I think it could do more harm than good, because it's just too little researched, I think, because normally it takes our researchers 10-15 years or so for a real and good vaccine to create a flawless vaccine product.
That is correct. But what is being done now is what you have just described as rapid bleaching, that is vaccine products that can be used in a rapid manner too.
Being brewed together, sorry.
Are insufficiently and only negligently researched. Consequently, no relevant and verifiably valuable test results are available which prove their effectiveness and harmlessness. Consequently, the whole thing, as you have just said, can be described as hastily brewed. Such an unresearched vaccine is not only dubious but also dangerous, because the rapid bleaching you mentioned lacks any long experience of trials and tests to guarantee the safety and efficacy of the product. However, as regards the emergence of a vaccine against the coronavirus, which should prove to be suitable, safe and effective, the question arises as to its effectiveness, whether this will be positive or negative if it is used for vaccination. I doubt, however, that such an insufficiently researched and untested medium will be a preparation of effective and positive efficacy, and I doubt that there will be any counterproductive reactions or effects.
So you are saying that such rapid bleaching vaccines may cause adverse effects, such as suffering and diseases?
Yes, and not only direct, but especially late effects, which can have very long-term effects.
So the whole thing doesn't exactly look rosy. So any earthling, he or she, who gets vaccinated, gets involved in a roulette game, so to speak.
You can say that, yes. But now, Eduard, dear friend, it is time for me, because I must do my duty. Farewell, Salome, and goodbye.
Have a good time too, Ptaah. Goodbye, dear friend.